The Honourable Niall Blair.
Mr Deputy President, I rise on behalf of the government to provide a contribution to the Animal Research Amendment Reduction in Deaths of Dogs and Cats Used for Research Bill 2018. Can I just start by going through the overview of the bill? The objects of the bill is to amend the Animal Research Act 1985 to require a person, as a condition of the person's accreditation as a research establishment or the person's animal research authority, to take all reasonable steps to home a dog or cat that is no longer required by the person for animal research purposes unless a vet has determined that the dog or cat is not suitable to be rehomed. Such reasonable steps include A, socialising or training the dog or cat to ensure the dog or cat is suitable for rehoming, or B, causing the dog or cat to be given a person to a person or an animal rehoming organisation, or C, any other action taken in accordance with the code of practice under that Act. The bill provides that a dog or cat is taken to be no longer required by a person for animal research purposes if the dog or cat has been kept by the person for more than 6 months, and failure to comply with the proposed requirement is grounds for a complaint under Part 4 of the Animal Research Act 1985 and may result in the cancellation or suspension of the person's accreditation or authority. Mr Deputy President, can I from the outset indicate that the New South Wales Government is committed to improving animal welfare and supports in principle the concept that research facilities should attempt rehoming of animals and, in the first instance, better report on animals used for research purposes. I've stood here on many times and promoted the good work our agencies and industries do to review, evaluate and improve animal welfare outcomes. I'm equally happy to stand here and talk about the robust framework we have in place for animals, in particular dogs and cats involved in research. Those in the House will also know that I'm not afraid to review current legislation to consider the views of all stakeholders of government, consider views of all sides of government and take a deep dive into making sure we haven't left any aspects unturned. Mr Deputy President, that is what I've done with this bill brought forward by the Honourable Mark Pearson. I would like to acknowledge the work that Mr Pearson and his team have put into this area and say that Mr Pearson has identified a gap in our animal research reporting, and I've taken on board what he and his team have suggested. I've listened to his arguments, and today, while I cannot support the bill in its current form, I will be acting on some of the aspects within it, which I will talk to shortly. Mr Deputy President, in New South Wales, the use of animals for research is regulated by the Animal Research Act 1985, which sets out stringent requirements designed to protect the welfare of animals used. All research institutions must also comply with the Australian Code for the Care and Use of Animals for Scientific Purposes. Research institutions must be accredited under the Act, and research must be carried out under the approval and monitoring of an establishment's Animal Ethics Committee. The required membership of animal ethics committees is set out in the Code and must include a veterinarian, a researcher, an animal welfare representative and an independent representative. Each application to the Animal Ethics Committee must include detailed information, including the justification for the use of animals, as well as the impacts of all parts of the research project on the animals and how these impacts will be minimised. The source of animals must also be assessed. Accredited research institutions under the Act are audited for compliance with the legislation by government veterinary inspectors from the New South Wales Department of Primary Industries and assessed by the Animal Research Review Panel. The panel is a 12-member ministerially appointed body under the Act and includes scientific and animal welfare representatives. Where institutions or individuals are found to be in contravention of these requirements, penalties of up to $17,600 and 12 months imprisonment can apply. Mr Deputy President, domestic cats and dogs are used in a wide range of research projects. In 2016, 1,230 cats and 4,275 dogs were used for research, and the vast majority of those projects involved only observations or minor interference. Many of these cats and dogs are not housed in laboratories but live at home with loving owners. Some examples of these research projects include palatability trials to assess dog and cat food, production of tick anti-serum for the treatment of dogs and cats affected by tick intoxication, cats housed long-term as blood donors, dogs and cats used in clinical trials to develop new treatments for dogs and cats, observational behavioural studies for privately owned dogs and cats, and education used for teaching students how to care for and handle cats and dogs, often with privately owned dogs and cats. Again, it is important to note that the majority of animal research involving dogs and cats in New South Wales are for projects that focus on observations or for minor interference, with many of them living at home with loving owners. Mr Deputy President, I'll now speak to the details of the bill. The bill seeks to amend the Animal Research Act 1985 to require animal research institutions and individuals to take all reasonable steps to home a dog or cat that is no longer needed for research purposes unless a vet has determined that the dog or cat is not suitable to be rehomed. The bill further proposes that cats and dogs should only be kept for research purposes for 6 months or 12 months with the approval of the Animal Research Review Panel, and that the panel should be responsible for coordinating rehoming activities via a publicly accessible database. Finally, the bill proposes that a cat or dog used for research purposes should not be euthanased without the approval of the responsible Animal Ethics Committee. Mr Deputy President, as I have alluded to previously, the government supports the intent of the bill, which is to improve rehoming rates of domestic cats and dogs used for research. However, the bill contains provisions that are not clearly defined and would result in perverse outcomes. It shifts the compliance burden from industry to government. It is inconsistent with the Australian Code for the Care and Use of Animals for Scientific Purposes and is not supported by the Animal Research Review Panel. The bill does not define reasonable steps, nor does it recognise that not all cats and dogs used for research will be suitable for rehoming, or that rehoming is not always the best animal welfare outcome for an animal. The bill also does not recognise that not all vets will have the necessary expertise in animal behaviour to decide if a cat or dog should be rehomed. Further, a limit on the time cats and dogs can be used for research projects would lead to perverse outcomes because many more cats and dogs would need to be used. The bill suggests that cats and dogs should only be kept for research purposes for 6 months or 12 months with the ARRP's approval. It must be noted that some research projects can continue for many years with little to no negative impact on the animal, and in many cases, the animals remain in the home and may receive low-level treatments of new tick and flea products, for example. Limiting the time that an animal may be kept for research purposes would lead to more dogs and cats being used in research trials. The bill proposes that the panel should coordinate rehoming activities. However, this would shift the compliance burden from industry onto government. There is an existing requirement under the Australian Code that the fate of animals used for research must be approved by the Animal Ethics Committee as part of the research project approval. The bill proposes that a subcommittee could also perform this role. However, this is not permitted under the Australian Code. Finally, the bill is not supported by the Animal Research Review Panel. And Mr Deputy President, for those reasons, the government does not support the bill in its current form. Mr Deputy President, the New South Wales Government is dedicated to safeguarding animals in the use of research and acknowledges that there is a need for better information to guide research institutions and individuals to know what all reasonable steps are. Rehoming cats and dogs used for research is difficult, and unfortunately not all cats and dogs are able to be rehomed. The Animal Research Review Panel understands this issue well and has already established a subcommittee to develop comprehensive guidelines for research institutions to help improve rehoming rates because it is a complex area. These guidelines are expected to be completed in the first quarter of 2019. I'd like to make it known that obviously if the New South Wales Liberals and Nationals return to government after March next year, and if I am the Minister responsible, it will be my intention to review the guidelines very carefully and in consultation with the ARRP, research institutions, rehoming bodies, or other key stakeholders to develop a mandatory code of practice by the way of regulation change under the Animal Research Act. I've been advised that we were unable to make a regulation change without a code of practice in existence in the first place, as industry experts, ARRP, will develop the guidelines in the first instance, which will then be used to develop a code of practice from that point forward. So, Mr Deputy President, can I make it clear? This is an area that does need to change, and we need a code of practice in this space, and it should be mandatory. And I want to make that clear. If I am no longer the minister after the March election, when this deadline is up, it might be another one of my colleagues that is the minister at that time. I will continue to chase that issue up. And not that I'm expecting this to occur, but if for some reason I'm sitting on the other side of the chamber after this time frame, I will then be advocating from that position to make sure this is an area that does need to be changed, and we should allow the industry to develop those guidelines from which we then can have that code of practice to be drafted, and then we would be able to put in the regulation to make sure that it is a mandatory code of practice in that sense. But in the interim, we agree that better information and data needs to be collected about what happens to cats and dogs used for research once a project is completed. You know, Mr Deputy President, and this is where I'm going to give the member opposite some credit in relation to this area, because he brought this issue to this House. I sat and listened to the second reading speech that he provided in relation to the numbers or lack of data associated with rehoming or attempted rehoming by these institutions. And I left that debate and I went to my office and I asked my agency to give me the numbers. And I couldn't get the numbers. So I'm not saying that this is an area in which they are underperforming. We just don't know. We don't know how many attempts have been made. And as Minister, that was not acceptable. I did not accept that we did not report or gather that information. And I think it's in the industry's best interest to be able to report on that information, to be able to say that they are making attempts in this area. And that's where I acknowledge that there is a gap. And as a result, we will be working with the Animal Research Review Panel to ensure that rehoming is adequately considered and reported by institutions that use domestic cats and dogs for research. And for those interested, I encourage you to visit the Animal Ethics Info link, which houses all the relevant information in this space. Included on the site are a list of reporting forms that research institutions must use. Form L, Animal Use Statistics, will be updated this year to include the need for research institutions to report on what happens to dogs and cats after they have been used for research. Reporting cycles follow the calendar year, so that as of January 2019, this additional information will be collected. So the fact that I couldn't find the information easily when I asked the question, that's something that we're changing as a result of this today, Mr Deputy President. That form is going to be updated. That information is going to be then provided, and within the next reporting year starting in January. That is, I think, a better outcome, a good outcome, and something that doesn't necessarily need us to change legislation, but something that should be occurring. Mr Deputy President, this bill will not achieve its intended purpose of reducing the number of deaths of dogs and cats used in connection with animal research, and the government therefore opposes the bill. In fact, it's actually one area that I wouldn't mind touching on, because I raised this issue with the member when we discussed the bill, and one of the issues that I raised with him was actually the title of the bill, because I think it's actually misleading. Then the title says, Animal Research Amendment, Reduction in Deaths of Dogs and Cats Used for Research. That's insinuating that there are a large number of animals that are dying during research. And I actually don't think that was the intent of the member, because when I look at the statistics, when we look at different categories, for cats, for example, we actually have a reporting figure that says death as an endpoint. So this is death, giving approvals for animals to die during testing. There hasn't been an approval in that area since 2010, for example. And I know when I spoke to the member, I'm not going to verbal him, he'll have an opportunity to reply, that the issue for I think what this bill is trying to do is not address the fact that we are losing dogs and cats during research, particularly because death as an endpoint is not something that we are seeing any approval since 2010 on, for example, with cats there. And it's not so much about them dying during the research, particularly when we look at a vast majority of the types of research that's being undertaken is in areas where we're using things like observation involving minor interference. I think the issue here is what's happening to the animals once they finish being used for research and testing. And as I said, I don't want to verbal the member. He'll be able to address that issue. But I don't think that what this bill is trying to do is reduce the numbers down. It almost should have been retitled the Animals Used for Research Rehoming Bill, for example. Again, it's not my bill, but that's my observation and my discussions in relation to this area. I'd like to thank the Honourable Mark Pearson for bringing the issue to our attention and for helping us identify opportunities for the government to further strengthen the existing regulatory framework for research animals. I think this has been a very noble attempt to address this issue by the member. I understand that when you are getting Parliamentary Council to draft something like this, that there can be some challenges in some of the wording. There are always those line ball discussions around whether you do put timelines in or not, and I think that the attempt for the inclusion of a timeline for the length that animals are used is probably one that I think probably would have or should have or could have been worded better. I think that as a result of this bill, we are getting better animal welfare outcomes. I'm happy to have worked with the member on this issue. I appreciate the time that Mr Pearson and his staff have dedicated to sitting down and discussing these issues with us. I'm proud that we can make the reporting changes immediately. I reiterate that I have put the industry on notice when it comes to the code of practice, that is an expectation that they get on and develop those guidelines quickly, and then we will be moving to make sure that they end up in regulation to be a code of practice from here going forward. And for those reasons, I'll once again congratulate the member on what he's attempting to do. In principle, we agree. However, the way that the bill has been presented, I think for some of the unintended consequences, we can't support it in its current form. But I hope that what we've been able to do and change goes to some way to addressing the concerns that the member has identified. And for those reasons, the government opposes the bill.
Thank you. Minister.